Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Everett, President of the Society for Neuroscience, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the David Kopf Lecture on Neuroethics. I'd like to first take this opportunity to thank David Kopf Instruments for its continuing support of this lecture, which illuminates the importance of interdisciplinary research by exploring how the interactions between neuroscience and ethics manifest in society. It's a privilege to introduce today's speaker, Jennifer Chandler, JD, LLM, who is a full professor in the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law with a cross-appointment in the Faculty of Medicine. She's also a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Institute for the Administration of Justice and an associate editor for the journal Neuroethics. Professor Chandler received degrees in law from Harvard University and Queen's University, and a degree in biology from the University of Western Ontario. She studies the legal and ethical aspects of biomedical science and technology, with a focus on the intersection of the brain sciences, law, and ethics. Jennifer also works on legal policy related to organ donation and transplantation, and mental health law and policy. I now warmly welcome Professor Chandler to give her lecture entitled The Law and Neuroprosthetics.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Chandler. I'm a professor of law at the University of Ottawa up in Canada. It's really a tremendous honor to be here with you today and to be speaking to you about the law and neuroprostheses. So the topic I've chosen is this question of the legal response to emerging neuroprostheses. And before I launch into this, I do want to speak briefly about a bit of a roadmap of where I'm planning to go, so you'll be able to figure out where I am in the course of the next 40 or so minutes. So essentially, you might ask, is there anything really new here? Human beings have been using prostheses for quite a long time. Is there something new to be worried about here? Do we need a new legal response to neuroprostheses? And so I'll have just a couple quick words about that, but also identify some of the concerns that are emerging around neuroprostheses that one sees in neuroethical and legal discussions as a bit of a foundation for thinking about what should the law do about this. And the law is a complex toolkit, and the statement that there ought to be a law to deal with something is itself not a helpful, not a sufficiently detailed approach to the question. We will see also that law has tremendous inherent flexibility, that we are able to articulate rules at a level of abstraction that allows them to address novel problems that come up within societies, including new technologies. So there's a question about what law, even if we get to the point of there ought to be a law. And I think one very useful way of trying to get a grip on this question is to return to what are the fundamental human interests at stake. When we identify a range of concerns, what exactly is bothering us? Can we organize those fundamental human interests as a way of sharpening the question about what should a law be in a particular given instance of a neuroprosthesis that's being deployed and raising concerns? So I want to propose to you a set of 6 different types of fundamental human interest, and I'll discuss each of them in relation to neuroprostheses with some examples, and then conclude with a couple of potential legal puzzles we may face in the coming years over hybrid minds. And by hybrid mind, I'm referring here to the use of a neuroprosthesis by a person such that you have a mind, a brain, hardware and software all in interaction, and often mutually adapting interaction over time, creating an emerging properties that could be understood as a form of hybrid. So let me start with this question: is there anything really new here at all? After all, and I put this Cairo toe, this is the Cairo toe, this image. It's a really impressive physical prosthesis that's 3,000 years old, just about 900 BC. And was to replace a lost body part. And of course, prostheses don't just replace lost body parts, but also replaced lost functions. And an example, a couple of 100 years old, then is the series of ear trumpets used by Beethoven and of course by many others over the years to replace or support degraded auditory function. So if a prostheses have been used for these thousands and hundreds of years, what exactly is the problem? What's new? Why are we having this discussion? And I guess the answer that I would put to that is that these neuroprostheses feel like a bit of a step change in terms of the kinds of prostheses that have gone before in various ways. And of course, we do already and have long had some neuroprostheses. Deep brain stimulation has been ongoing for several decades. Cochlear implants have been around for a while, but we also have a growing number and variation of neuroprostheses, increasingly targeting a whole new range of different kinds of functional problems. And in particular, I'd say that the neuroprostheses today are different in their ability to interact directly with the brain, either to read in, or I should say write in information or read out. My slide has got the words backwards there, but through neurostimulation or other techniques to impart informational content into the brain, influencing the mental contents and brain function, excuse me, as well as to monitor brains and to like read out information from those brains, whether it is the detection of imagined speech in people who are unable to communicate due to severe motor paralysis, for example. So this direct interaction with the brain is something that seems new. Another piece of it is the move toward adaptive closed loop systems, the integration of algorithms to determine the input on the basis of input to the brain, I should say, on the basis of a range of biomarkers, which themselves may be neurological, but need not be solely neurological. So the complexity of these systems is increasing. And to incorporate forms of artificial intelligence that are able to optimize the system functioning as a whole on the basis of some trade-off of treatment effects versus side effects in real time in different environments adds up to a system that is distinctly more complicated to understand, and the function of which becomes more difficult to predict as well, which I think is a difference if one looks back at the Cairo toe, for example. Another piece is the incorporation of artificial sensory feedback. So if we imagine a robotic, or I should say not a robotic, but a prosthetic arm, the incorporation of haptic feedback to basically make it easier for a person to use. It adds another dimension to the use of a prosthesis that did not exist in prior versions of prosthetic arms and might affect the phenomenological or lived experience of its use, as well as making it actually perhaps more easier to use. The linking of these various devices through wireless technologies, for example, to permit telemedicine and monitoring and tuning of devices is something that's different and raises a whole host of issues with respect to the security of the data flow, the cybersecurity if connected to the internet that did not exist with others. And of course, miniaturization of many of these technologies, neural dust and stentrodes and things that will potentially permit the greater deployment for a greater range of applications are things that are new as well. So all of this together, I guess I suggest to you, makes the neuroprostheses a bit different from some of the issues we might have discussed in prior iterations of prosthetic technology. And one aspect of it is that a lot of these prostheses, in a way, and I'm speaking in very, I guess, vague language here, but they, in interacting directly with the brain, in influencing mental contents and conscious experience, they get more directly at the core of a person, the mind and the brain of the person, than other prostheses. Of course, other prostheses influence the nervous system indirectly and in various ways, but this direct interaction feels that it is different in important ways from prior technologies. And the other aspect as well is the move toward not merely the replacement of lost body parts or the replacement of body functions, but the addition of new functions. So the sort of cyborg beyond species typical functioning that is being made capable here. And to some extent, this exists with non-neuro technologies. You may be familiar with the dispute over Oscar Pistorius and the cheetah, the lower limb prostheses that he used, and the dispute over whether this was could be used in the Olympic Games context. But returning to neuroprostheses and novel forms of function that are possible, and just cite you the one example of the bridging of brains, or of techniques to allow for signals from one brain to be transmitted to another brain directly. So suggesting a different form of communication than we've had beforehand. A further example would be the antenna of Neil Harbison, which I'll get back to in subsequent slides, but this is an antenna that's osseointegrated into the skull, that allows for the conversion of various forms of perception of the environment to be converted into sound, transmitted to the wearer. And this might seem like it is a new form of sensory perception. On the other hand, you could also view this as, in Neil Harbison's case, as the replacement of a lost or absent function that is a normal function, because Neil Harbison is colorblind, and he has in this way designed this antenna to provide different sound frequency stimuli as a function of what colors are around him. So this could be understood as the restoration or provision of a species typical function, as opposed to providing a new function. So my point is, in essence, that there's a whole range of possibilities here, from the replacement of, quote, normal functions to the supply of stimuli in different forms to replace that function, that normal function that doesn't exist, all the way to functions that are entirely new. So all of this together feels like there's something to talk about. And indeed, people are talking about this. So one can, you may have heard of the emerging discussion of neuro rights and the need for the recognition and declaration of a novel set of neuro rights to address the range of concerns that are said to arise in relation to this growing field of neuroprostheses. And so these recent calls have had some traction in some countries, which have been looking at modifying constitutional laws to address some of these concerns. And sort of boiled down simply, these calls for neuro rights reflect concerns about 5 main things. First is concern over the privacy of neural data. What can it be used for? Who can collect it, and so forth. The next has to do with the protection of the self. And here the concern is that technologies might blur the line between the human consciousness and potential external inputs into that consciousness, such that the self, or the perception of the self, is undermined. And so there's concern about the protection of the integrity of the self and self-consciousness. The third is a little bit different. This is about essentially freedom of the will and free choice, and concern that an unknown influence might manipulate a person's ability to make decisions through the vectors of these neurotechnologies. The fourth and fifth have more to do with fairness and equality, as opposed to liberty or safety. And the fourth has to do with fair access to enhancement neurotechnologies, and reflects the concern discussed generally with respect to cognitive enhancement technologies, that some will have access and others won't, and there will be a widening gap between those two groups. And finally, protection from bias in algorithms is mentioned as an area in which a neuro right ought to be declared or recognized as well. So I prefer not to engage with that further at this point, except to say that whether we need these neuro rights or whether existing laws are adequate to address these kinds of concerns, or in fact, at what level or in what form of law these kinds of protections ought to be adopted or recognized, are all, to me, open questions of significant importance and interest. And so if we step back for a moment and say, well, what is the legal system supposed to do? Because maybe a law is not the right way to address some of these concerns. Maybe there's other social mechanisms that are preferable. But if we think of a legal system as a system that's meant to influence behavior, something that's meant to encourage some behaviors and discourage others, that's one potential function. Another potential function is to avoid conflicts by clarifying protected interests, rights, and duties. And conflict is avoided by that clarification because everyone knows where they stand in terms of what they owe to others and can expect from others. And the hope is people will abide by it and thereby avoid conflict and not have to have arguments after the fact over who did wrong. Of course, people do wrong, and so the law will be called upon to resolve conflicts when they arise as well. And throughout all of these functions, laws are always having to balance competing interests. So even if we were to identify fundamental interests, individual interests, there's often the case that there will be others, or in fact society at large, that might have some competing interests. And so one sort of problem that the law has to grapple with is how to actually reconcile or compromise between these interests. And so what I'd like to do in the rest of the time that I have here with you is to actually come back to this question: what are the fundamental human interests at stake when we talk about neuroprostheses? What underlies, I should say, the concerns that have been articulated above in the slide with respect to neuro rights? And so I'm going to turn now to go through 6 of these with you. And I'll conclude with a couple of legal puzzles that emerge. And part of the reason I want to do it this way is that there's a variety of dichotomies in the law. It's a kind of a legal ontology, as you would, a way that the law classifies reality and then responds to it. And a couple of these key ones are distinctions between the person and an object. These two receive different treatment in the law. Between the body and the mind, the law is unfortunately dualistic in many ways, and different rules apply often to bodily and mental aspects of the person. In terms of property, there's different rules for tangible objects versus intangible forms of interest in things, such as intellectual property. And there's a host of these dichotomies which come up when we're talking about neuroprostheses. If we think about how this hybrid mind that I propose to you is a combination of the physical brain, the mental aspect of the person, hardware, the physical implanted or worn or other technology, as well as the software that runs on it. We have, in essence, elements from cutting across many of these legal categories, leading to some confusion about which particular law should apply. Do we have to somehow recognize some sort of modification to the way we approach these categories? The law can do this. After all, corporations are legal persons. In some places, rivers are legal persons. So there is a lot of flexibility here. But if we come back to what are the fundamental human interests at stake, we're well positioned then to see, do the laws, do the legal resources actually get us where we need to get to? What sorts of modifications, amendments, or indeed neuro rights might we need to declare or create to respond? So the first set of interests I want to discuss are perhaps the most obvious ones. We're all very obviously interested in our bodily integrity and security. This is fundamental. Now, when we talk about neuroprostheses, they range to a great degree in the amount of physical connection with the body. So we can have wearable brain-computer interfaces, we can have implanted or inserted neuroprostheses, and I have pictures of a stent rod and an X-ray of a deep brain stimulator inserted into the brain. And you could even imagine something that's even more closely integrated with the body in the form of optogenetic technologies. If that were to be used in a human being, you would have modifications at the cellular level that are arguably even more integrated, shall we say, than something that's inserted or implanted, which is in principle reversible with some risk due to brain surgery and potential damage to brain tissue. But you see the spectrum of the increasingly close integration of the prosthesis with the body. And so that if there is going to be disruption of that, removal, the level of harm and risk is accordingly greater, even maybe at one end of the spectrum becoming impossible. And so some of the legal questions that might come up here is, at what point should we classify the device as part of the body, as opposed to remaining an object or property? And a concrete reason why this becomes important and interesting is, what about the clauses in neuroprosthetic research, which declare that there is going to be explantation at the conclusion of the research? Is the person, what is the legal status of a person's agreement to return that device? Is it now part of the person? People are generally entitled to refuse surgical interference with their body to remove it. What would then be the remedy if they didn't give it up? Would there be payment of damages for withholding of property? Or do we understand this now as part of the body, that there's not any obligation to give up? We don't generally enforce a range of contractual promises in relation to body parts. Nobody who agrees to give a kidney is sued if they change their mind. So how do we understand the role of this device as property or body along the spectrum? The second example is this issue of phenomenological interests in prostheses. So as an entrance into this discussion, I refer back to the classic example from the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who wrote about the blind man with the stick. And he points out that after long-term use, the blind man feels that the cane is an extension of his senses. It's part of the body. The tip of the body is the junction between the body. Sorry, the tip of the cane is the junction between the body and the external world. And I think many of us have had a similar experience in using a pen. One becomes unaware of the connection between fingers and pen, and all attention is drawn to the tip of the pen and its contact with the paper. We can say that the tool has become embodied, and it has become transparent. It has faded from awareness, and instead our attention is drawn to the interaction of the tool with the environment, which we perceive as our own body interacting with the environment. And it turns out through research on embodiment that humans can be quite flexible in terms of what objects they're able to incorporate into their body schema, that they're able to embody. And indeed, this kind of effective embodiment is a design objective of successful prostheses. You want it to fade away from awareness and just become part of the person and usable in that way. It's less obtrusive, it's less intrusive, it's easier to use. So if humans are flexible about this, and how do we understand the nature of the harm that comes with disruption of this phenomenological embodiment of the tool? And before moving on, I just want to point out there is an interesting discussion, different dimensions of embodiment. And one of them is known as affective embodiment. And this refers to situations in which a threat to the prosthesis induces a kind of a physiological response of self-preservation and a stress response. So one reacts as if one is about to be physically hurt when the prosthesis is threatened. So taking that on board, what should we be looking for when thinking about haptic feedback in the context of a prosthetic limb, for example? So on the left hand of my slide, I have an image of someone using a prosthetic limb who is receiving from sensors in the fingers haptic feedback about the interaction of that prosthesis with the world. And this is meant to make it easier to use this prosthesis. But with this kind of haptic feedback, what is the phenomenological experience of using this limb? Does it become more integrated at an affective level, for example, such that if that limb is harmed, we could say that there's a physiological, I should say, a psychological or emotional harm done to the person. The person is threatened in the same way as a physical threat to the body. And this becomes relevant in the context of tort law and evaluating also the justifiability of violent self-defense, for example. So a variety of legal questions might come to bear when we start to understand phenomenological level of interest in a prosthesis. The third type of interest I'd like to discuss is this issue of reliance on the prosthesis that can come about. And at its most extreme level would be a survival reliance. Without this prosthesis, the person does not survive. This is an extreme case. I'll talk about a lesser degree of reliance in the next slide. And in various locations in the course of the last couple of years, we've seen discussions of triage and ventilators. And so an example, which I think illustrates what I'm trying to get at here, is the statement made by Alice Wong of the Disability Visibility Project, who's quoted in an article by NEMA in 2020, in discussions over how ventilators should be allocated during pandemics and whether some people on ventilators should be displaced by others. She said, my ventilator is part of my body. I cannot be without it for more than an hour at the most due to my neuromuscular disability. For clinicians or for society, for anybody to take away my ventilator would be an assault on my personhood and lead to my death. And I think the language is telling here. This is a statement that the ventilator is part of her body, and to remove it would be an attack on her very person. So this is very different formulation than saying this is an object that is important to me that I rely upon. It is actually part of me, and we tend to grant a much greater degree of protection to the body than to property. And this kind of formulation is invoking that kind of claim. So this is an example of how neuroprosthesis might be, or I should say, this is an example of how a prosthesis, a breathing prosthesis could be central to survival, but it's also possible for a neuroprosthesis to be central to physical survival as well in another sense. So here I refer to qualitative research involving people with chronic pain. One woman reporting from an article by Racine and colleagues from 2018, from Weiss and colleagues in 2018, a woman reporting that if she didn't have her spinal cord stimulator, she would have committed suicide a long time ago. So it is possible for a neuroprosthesis in that way to preserve life by essentially making quality of life acceptable. So that's a little bit different from ventilator, obviously, but it does suggest a kind of a survival level interest in a neuroprosthesis in this case. And stepping away from physical survival into an idea of psychological survival, I'd like to propose to you that a neuroprosthesis could be understood also as integral to psychological survival or survival of personhood. So there's a little picture there of the 17th century philosopher John Locke, who talked a lot about personhood, the person, and the central importance of consciousness and memory, psychological continuity to the continuity of a person over time. And for him, it was consciousness and memory that bound sort of successive states of an individual together into continued or enduring personhood. And without these, there would be loss of the person. And so to the extent that various neural prostheses are being developed to address memory loss, hippocampal neuroprostheses to help in the formation and also the retention of memories, one can see that a neuroprosthetic could actually serve a role of the survival at the psychological level of a human person. So another form of reliance interest, I'm calling functional interest. It's also reliance like the previous one, but not for survival. Instead, this is a reliance to be able to have a particular physical or mental function that's important. And before launching into the neuro side, I want to give you two legal cases to illustrate or exemplify the kinds of discussions that we'll have about the neuroprostheses. So case one, Collins and the airline, reported in Glenn 2012. This was a story of Mr. Collins, who had severe traumatic injury leading to major mobility impairment. And he used a very elaborate form of mobility assistance device, a chair, which helped to keep him upright and also allowed him to move around. The airline in this case called it a wheelchair, but it was much more than a simple wheelchair. Now, it was delayed during it was damaged during transport. And the airline said, okay, no worries, we'll get this fixed. Turned out there was an enormous delay of over a year. And during this time, Collins was essentially bedridden. He had a variety of financial losses. He had to hire a lot of people to do things that he might otherwise have done. And also he developed a whole range of pressure ulcers and medical complications. And so when it came time to discuss what payment would be made for damages, the airline said, well, on the back of your ticket, this is how we handle baggage claims, and damages are limited to replacement, and we replaced it. That's the end of the story. Collins, on the other hand, and his lawyer said, actually, no, this mobility assistance device, this is not baggage, this is not an object, it's an extension of the body. And so when you damaged it, you caused bodily harm, which is in a different category of things, and is not subject to the limitations on the back of the ticket having to do with baggage claim. Now, this case eventually settled. We didn't have a judge weigh in on how to characterize the status of this mobility assistance device, but note again the importance of the shift from property to body. Another example from a French court this time dealt with a woman who had a denture fitted and then didn't pay for the denture completely, and returning to the dentist for subsequent dental services, the dentist decided to keep the denture for non-payment. And this goes to court, and there's a difference of opinion at the two levels of the French court. Initially, the French court said, well, the denture is an object you use to help you eat, and you should pay for it, like you have to pay for other objects. And the appeal court then disagreed and said, well, actually, you are allowed to seize objects for non-payment, but that doesn't apply to objects that are an integral part of the human person. And in this context, this denture is a prosthetic device that's become an integral part of the human person. So that is an interesting question. In both of these cases, we deal with a device that is important to the person in different ways for different functions, has not become physically integrated like an osseo-integrated hip replacement, for example, might do, or not implanted like a deep brain stimulator. And yet the argument is that this is part of the body. So with turning to neuroprostheses, we can see many potential instances in which neuroprosthesis can serve a functional interest, for example, movement disorders and deep brain stimulation. But the question I want to pose in relation to this is, what should we do in the case where a prosthesis actually doesn't restore, shall we call it, a normal or species typical function, but actually supplies a supranormal function? Would we take the same approach in that circumstance if this object is allowing the person to transcend the species typical functions and is damaged? Would we say, well, a part of that person's body has been damaged? Or would we say that's damage to property that you use to acquire unusual abilities that nobody else has? So if we look at the examples I have there, if someone damages your binoculars, the binoculars do give you supranormal ability to see, but I don't think we would say that's part of the body. What about Neil Harbison's antenna, osseo-integrated, that allows him to hear color? In this case, this could be viewed as a supranormal capacity, or it could be viewed as the replacement of a species typical capacity that he lacks, namely the ability to see color, given that he's colorblind. So what I'm getting at here is this long discussed and thorny distinction between what is therapeutic what is enhancement, and whether this line in the middle, often said to be what is normal or species typical, should be a line that might help us decide whether a piece of property should be understood as part of the body or as property. Nice to have it, but not part of the property, not part of the body. So I have two more examples to go. This is the second to last one. The social interests in prostheses are also very interesting as well. So one can imagine a range of prostheses used for, shall we call them, cosmetic purposes, namely to try to ease social interaction or embarrassment that might be felt in the presence of disfigurement, for example. The role of breast implants as well has a range of social functions and signaling implications. But in the context of neuroprostheses, I want to explore this idea of the prosthesis as an element of social identity or group membership and its potential political significance. So there was a number of years ago a debate over whether the cochlear implant was a useful prosthesis that enabled children who were born deaf to hear and acquire natural speech if applied early enough, or conversely, was a means by which members of the deaf community were removed from it before they had an option to choose in a way that harmed the deaf community by essentially depopulating it, and referred to as an ethnocide. And so this is an interesting, was a very interesting debate, and I think one that we might see in coming years potentially with other forms of neuroprosthesis. So if we think about the neurodiversity movement, which arose a number of years ago, primarily from people with autism spectrum conditions, who were arguing this is not a pathology to be cured, this is instead a different non-neurotypical neurological makeup, which should be understood as one of a range of permissible ways of being human as part of the natural neurological diversity amongst human beings. And so not to be pathologized and medicalized, but instead to be recognized and accepted and celebrated for its particular attributes and skills. So how then are we likely to see reactions to neuroprostheses meant to address, for example, autism spectrum disorder? And one can see research into the use of DBS at the level of very severe impairment with autism spectrum disorder, not discussed evidently for milder instances. But nonetheless, I raise it as an example of how the prosthesis, the DBS in this case, might find itself within the middle of discussions analogous to that were undertaken in relation to the cochlear implant. So my last example of fundamental human interest at stake with neuroprostheses is this issue of informational interests. And what I'm getting at here is that a prosthesis is in some ways a new access point to the person. It can be, not with all of them obviously, but with some, and particularly with neuroprostheses, could serve as an access point to the person. It allows for a location at which information is collected about the person, and conversely can be transmitted into the person, into their mind, into their brain. And so before moving on to discussing that more, let me come back to an example of a case drawn from a non-neuro context. So in the case of Ohio versus Ross Compton from 2016, there was a man accused of arson. It was an insurance dispute. His house burned down, and it was suspected that he had set the fire to collect insurance funds. And so he was prosecuted for arson. And the police sought and secured a search warrant to access his pacemaker data. This was granted, and it was analyzed by a cardiologist who testified that Compton's account of his activities at the time of the fire was highly improbable in light of the data on his pacemaker. Tremendously interesting that the data collected there becomes then available to impeach his credibility. And it's interesting when we think about this in the context of the privilege against self-incrimination, for example, and at what point and how are we going to distinguish between statements one may make about oneself versus bodily samples, DNA, or data of the cardio pacemaker variety? To what extent do our rules developed to address torture and to exclude statements end up translating into these other potential forms of data that might actually impeach our credibility if we're accused of a crime? So should other data stored in these kinds of prostheses, including neuroprostheses, be made available in this way? And I put a little screen grab from an article discussing the decoding of speech from the motor cortex in people with severe motor impairments. And this is an extremely interesting form of communication neurotechnology that's developing, very promising, but appears to be able, to some extent, still early days, but to be able to detect imagined speech. And so do we assimilate that to pacemaker data? Do we assimilate that to spoken speech? It will be interesting to know the degree of decoding and interpretation that's made in the device of the speech, the extent to which the person is able to control the detection of this imagined speech, and so forth. I think that an important piece of thinking about this also is that, as we've seen during COVID, a tremendous interest in telemedicine and teleprogramming, and a taste for it is very convenient and efficient, helps to extend medical care to a much broader range of people who live away from major centers, for example. And so there's a lot of interest in this teleprogramming of deep brain stimulation devices. If this is to be done in this way, this possibility of hijacking or disrupting the information flow becomes a real issue. And we've already seen insulin pumps recalled due to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So this is all part and parcel of the informational aspects of these neuroprostheses. And I'd close on this point just by observing that to the extent that users of prostheses are already a vulnerable group by virtue of having impairments and disabilities, the fact that they are the only ones who will have this singular and unusual access point to their bodies, information about their bodies and minds, could be said to compound vulnerability of users. So let me conclude with 4 quick legal puzzles. The first is, will neuroprostheses mean that you have to have a license to your own mind if you use one? So if we think of a neurostimulation device as often including hardware and software, the software, it's a little bit hard to get your hands on these license agreements, but I've been trying and have found a few. The licenses, the software licenses, often limit what the user can do with the software. And since software is never owned by the user, but it's licensed to the user, we set up a situation where you could be said to have a license to some component of your own mind. In the brown box, who owns neural data? So we have a device that is monitoring and collecting neural data. Is this to be understood as the personal information, like bodily information of the person? Or could we understand it as an intellectual creation of the user? For example, if a device were to detect an imagined poem of the user. Or do we have to view it as a creation or co-creation with the maker of the prosthesis, who after all is doing a significant amount of interpretation and contribution to both the collection and the interpretation of that data? Third, who's responsible for mental states when we have actually a system, a hybrid system involving mind, brain, hardware, and software that collectively produce particular mental states and resulting behavior and moods? How do we understand it? It becomes even more complex, where you have ongoing mutual adaptation of these different parts of the system to each other. because then we start to diverge from what might have been intended by the initial maker of the prosthesis and the software included within it. And then finally, what about legacy neuroprosthetic systems? Is a person entitled to refuse upgrades? Is a company required to support legacy systems? What do we do with the bankruptcy of neuroprosthesis systems companies? So I close with those 4 little questions, just as examples of the kinds of interesting things that we may have to sort out as neurotechnology continues its fascinating and really promising evolution. So I'll close there, and thank you so very much for your interest and attention. And again, thank you so much for having me in this excellent conference.